In the opulent halls and shadowed chambers of the Tudor court, where politics pulsed and power shifted like the tides, a quieter revolution was unfolding, one written in ink by the hands of women. Though denied official authority and often silenced in public discourse, Tudor women wielded pens with profound effect, crafting letters, prayers, poems, and political arguments that whispered through corridors and echoed across centuries. These were not idle words, they were tools of influence, defiance, identity, and survival. From queens and princesses to learned daughters and martyrs, women at court navigated the treacherous terrain of monarchy, marriage, and religion with eloquence and strategic brilliance. This document explores how they wrote not only to express themselves, but to shape dynasties, stir reform, and inscribe their presence into a history that often sought to forget them. Through their words, we encounter intellect refined in captivity, resistance composed beneath royal robes, and the enduring truth that the pen could rival the crown in shaping the world. The Tudor period 1485 to 1603 stands as one of the most dynamic and transformative eras in English history. Stretching from the rise of Henry VII after the Wars of the Roses to the death of Elizabeth I, this epoch witnessed a series of sweeping changes in governance, religion, culture, and identity. It was a time marked by intense political drama, replete with courtly intrigue, dynastic battles, and religious revolutions, but also by a vibrant cultural renaissance. While monarchs and noblemen often dominate the historical spotlight, women at the Tudor court played a far more critical role than the official records often reveal. Behind the gilded veil of power, some of the most profound expressions of influence came not through the sword, crown, or pulpit, but through the pen. The Tudor court was not merely a political center but the very heart of national culture and identity. It functioned as both a theatrical stage and a site of genuine influence, where display and symbolism were as powerful as military might. Within its walls, art and literature thrived. Court masques, poetry recitals, and intellectual debates often mirrored the ideological battles of the realm. The written word held immense power, it shaped perception, advanced agendas, and preserved legacies. Literacy, though still largely confined to the elite, was gaining prominence and symbolic significance. In this world, to write was to assert one's presence, influence minds, and shape history. For women, the stakes surrounding writing were especially high. Publicly, their voices were marginalized by custom, religion, and law. They were often expected to remain silent, obedient, and invisible in matters of state or philosophy. Yet privately, many women cultivated deep intellectual lives, wrote with insight and sophistication, and wielded the pen to navigate their precarious positions within the structures of power. Their words became tools for negotiation, resistance, persuasion, and introspection. Whether composing letters to monarchs, translating theological texts, writing devotional meditations, or crafting poetry, women at the Tudor court found ways to assert their intelligence and agency within the confines of a patriarchal society. Letter writing, in particular, offered a rich medium for female expression. The courtly letter was more than a personal message. It was a political document, a diplomatic gesture, a performance of self. Women used letters to maintain alliances, express loyalty, manipulate relationships, and subtly insert themselves into political discourse. A well-timed and well-phrased letter could influence a monarch's favor or shape the outcome of court conflicts. The epistolatory form allowed noblewomen, queens, and even imprisoned figures to maintain a voice in national and religious matters. In an age when direct female authority was often deemed dangerous or unnatural, the letter provided an acceptable, yet potent, way to participate in the public sphere. Similarly, religious texts offered another avenue for female authorship. During the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, religious identity was in flux, and women found themselves both targets of scrutiny and vessels of transformation. Some women composed devotional works that conformed to traditional models of piety, while others, emboldened by Protestant calls for personal scriptural engagement, authored original meditations and commentaries. Translation, often dismissed as derivative by male scholars, became a subversive form of authorship for Tudor women, allowing them to interpret, adapt, and subtly reshape powerful theological ideas. Queens like Katherine Parr published works under their own names, directly engaging with the spiritual and political crises of their time. Others, like Lady Jane Grey and Anne Askew, used religious writing as a form of protest and martyrdom, embedding theological resistance in every phrase. Poetry also provided an intimate and expressive outlet for court women. Although rarely printed or formally acknowledged, many women engaged with poetic traditions in manuscript form. Their poems often reflected personal emotion, spiritual longing, or coded commentary on court politics. Some participated in poetic exchanges with male courtiers, while others composed for private devotion or inner reflection. In a culture where female virtue was constantly under surveillance, poetry offered a space for both emotional complexity and intellectual experimentation. The influence of these women, though often understated in official chronicles, was profound. Their writing not only reflected the concerns and values of their time but also helped shape the literary and ideological currents that defined the Tudor world. Many women writers at court blurred the lines between public and private, spiritual and political, personal and performative. Their words allowed them to construct identities, claim agency, and leave behind traces of their thoughts in a world that often sought to erase them. This video excavates and illuminates these hidden voices. It seeks not to romanticize these women as timeless heroines, but to understand them in their complex, constrained, and often courageous contexts. It will explore how noblewomen, queens, reformers, and scholars employed writing not only as a form of self-expression but as a means of participating in the great dramas of their age: succession, reformation, persecution, diplomacy, and inheritance. By exploring the complex relationship between gender, writing, and influence at the Tudor court, we can better appreciate how words shaped the world, and how women shaped those words. In doing so, we gain a richer, more inclusive understanding of Tudor history and a deeper appreciation for the women who, though often silenced in life, refused to be erased in ink. In Tudor England, the written word was both a personal tool and a powerful cultural force, especially for women operating within the strict constraints of gender and class. To fully appreciate how women at the Tudor court engaged with writing, whether through letters, translations, or devotional literature, it is essential to understand the wider context in which they lived. The structures of education, the social uses of writing, and the religious upheavals of the period all shaped what it meant for a woman to read, write, and be heard. These contextual foundations help illuminate not only the content of women's writings but also the strategic, often risky choices involved in producing them. Literacy among women in Tudor England was largely determined by class. Noble and aristocratic women had the greatest access to education, and among them, basic literacy was not unusual. Reading ability often preceded writing proficiency, and many elite women were encouraged to read scripture, moral treatises, and household management guides. However, full fluency in composition, especially in Latin or Greek, was rare and usually reserved for those who had exceptional access to education. The assumption that women did not need advanced intellectual training was still widespread, but the tide began to shift during the Tudor period, particularly under the influence of humanist thought. Humanism, with its emphasis on classical learning and moral development, had a profound impact on the education of elite girls. Renaissance humanists like Erasmus had championed the idea that women could benefit from a virtuous and literate upbringing, though always within the bounds of traditional roles. Wealthy families began to embrace these ideals, offering their daughters more structured education in languages, theology, and the humanities. This was especially true in courtly and royal households, where learning became a mark of refinement and prestige. The daughters of the nobility, including those of Thomas More and Thomas Boleyn, received humanist educations that rivaled or even exceeded those of some male counterparts. Margaret Roper, for instance, was celebrated across Europe for her Latin proficiency and intellectual discipline. Private tutors played a central role in delivering this education. Since formal schooling for girls was extremely limited, individual instruction became the primary avenue for learning. These tutors, often priests or scholars, provided training in grammar, rhetoric, and religious doctrine. Queen Katherine Parr's household stands as a remarkable example of this educational environment. Under her guidance, the future Elizabeth I and Lady Jane Grey received extensive classical education, including instruction in several languages and theological texts. Katherine Parr herself was a published writer and an advocate of women's intellectual participation, setting a model for how writing could coexist with, and even enhance, female virtue and obedience. Yet education alone did not guarantee a voice in public life. The act of writing had social functions far beyond the personal or academic. In Tudor society, writing was a form of currency, used to communicate allegiance, convey political views, secure patronage, and preserve legacy. For women, writing could be a lifeline or a trap depending on the context. Letters, in particular, were essential tools in the arsenal of elite women. These were not informal notes but carefully crafted documents, often designed to influence or persuade. A well-written letter could sway a monarch, patch a family rift, or negotiate a marriage contract. For a woman, to write a letter was to engage in diplomacy, even if she lacked formal political authority. Moreover, letters allowed women to maneuver through the social constraints that limited their public speech. While they might not be permitted to address the court directly or publish controversial opinions, women could circulate letters that spoke volumes. These documents were sometimes preserved, copied, and even used as legal or political evidence. Writing became a performance of intelligence, virtue, loyalty, and strategic acumen. In many cases, it was also a shield, providing plausible deniability through the private or semi-private nature of correspondence. The question of how writing was circulated adds another layer to its social meaning. In an age when printing was still expensive and heavily monitored, most women's writings remained in manuscript form. These manuscripts might be passed between friends, shared within households, or read aloud in courtly circles. This limited circulation preserved a sense of exclusivity and intimacy but also ensured that these works reached an elite audience who could appreciate and potentially act upon their contents. The rarity and materiality of manuscripts added to their symbolic value, especially when paired with fine binding or personalized dedications. Print, though increasingly common, posed different challenges. It offered the potential for wider dissemination but also greater risk, especially under regimes sensitive to dissent. For women who were expected to be modest and silent in public matters, publication could be perceived as a transgressive act. Katherine Parr's decision to publish her religious texts under her name was both unprecedented and risky. She walked a fine line between pious queen and theological reformer, carefully framing her words to reflect humility and spiritual sincerity. The printed page offered permanence, but it also stripped away the protective layer of selective readership that manuscript culture provided. The social implications of writing cannot be fully understood without considering the religious context of the Tudor era. The period was defined by radical religious transformation, beginning with Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church and culminating in alternating regimes of Protestant and Catholic rule. These shifts had a profound effect on literacy and on the types of texts women were encouraged, or forbidden, to read and write. The Reformation, with its emphasis on individual engagement with Scripture, encouraged broader literacy and stimulated the production of religious texts in the vernacular. Women were drawn into this literary culture as both readers and writers, navigating competing religious ideologies through their pens. The English Bible, authorized by Henry VIII and later promoted by Edward VI, transformed how people thought about literacy and spiritual responsibility. No longer restricted to clergy or Latin scholars, the Bible in English empowered laypeople, including women, to explore their faith directly. This accessibility fostered a generation of devout, literate women who used their education to produce theological reflections, translate scripture, and compose prayers. Protestant reformers encouraged women to be spiritually active within the home, and writing became one of the most effective ways to do so. Devotional texts, meditations, and prayers served both as spiritual exercises and as quiet forms of resistance, especially under Catholic monarchs. However, the relationship between literacy and religion was fraught with tension. The very act of reading the Bible or writing religious texts could be deemed heretical, depending on the ruling monarch's faith. Under Mary I Catholic Restoration, Protestant writings became dangerous, and possession of banned texts could result in imprisonment or execution. Anne Askew, a noblewoman and outspoken Protestant, wrote powerful religious testimonies while being interrogated for heresy. Her written words became weapons in her trial and later, tools of martyrdom. She used writing to assert her theological stance, challenging both religious orthodoxy and gender norms. Her case illustrates how religious writing could be both personally empowering and politically explosive. The division between Protestant and Catholic approaches to female literacy also shaped the kinds of texts women could write. Protestantism, with its emphasis on the priesthood of all believers and the necessity of reading Scripture, encouraged more female literacy, especially in the vernacular. Women were expected to read the Bible, teach their children, and manage godly households. This expectation created a framework in which writing, especially religious writing, was not only acceptable but encouraged, provided it remained within the bounds of doctrinal correctness. Catholicism, on the other hand, emphasized tradition and clerical authority, and while some noblewomen in Catholic households were literate and intellectually active, their writing was often more constrained or focused on contemplative and devotional life. This religious fragmentation meant that female writers had to be especially attuned to the shifting political landscape. What was acceptable under one monarch could become fatal under another. Writing a Protestant commentary in 1548 might earn praise. The same text in 1555 might lead to charges of sedition. Women had to read the signs of the times carefully and tailor their writing accordingly. The safest path was to embed their views within pious language, humble prefaces, or translations of established works. But even then, their words could carry immense weight, shaping religious discourse in ways that still resonate. Taken together, these contexts, literacy, social function, and religious transformation, create a rich backdrop against which the writings of Tudor women can be understood. These women were not simply reacting to the forces around them, they were participating in and shaping the intellectual and political life of their time. Whether through the private elegance of a letter, the public boldness of a printed prayer, or the coded language of poetry, they used the written word to assert agency, claim authority, and forge legacies. Their work was both personal and political, shaped by circumstance but driven by intellect and intention. Understanding the conditions under which they wrote allows us to appreciate not only the courage it took to write, but the skill it took to do so effectively and survive. Margaret Beaufort, 1443–1509. Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby, stands as a towering matriarch of the Tudor dynasty and one of the most influential female figures in late medieval and early Tudor England. Although she did not leave behind volumes of personal writing, her legacy is deeply embedded in the religious, educational, and literary infrastructure of her time. Margaret's contributions to the written word came through her patronage, her support of translations, and her critical role in the early history of English printing. Through these efforts, she laid the groundwork for a generation of women, including her great-granddaughter Elizabeth I, who would engage directly with writing as a form of power. Born into the powerful Beaufort family, Margaret was a descendant of John of Gaunt, the third son of Edward III, which gave her a royal lineage. Married at a young age and widowed by 13, she gave birth to her only son Henry Tudor in 1457. Her life from that point became singularly focused on securing his future. Her careful navigation of the Wars of the Roses, strategic marriages, and alliances all culminated in Henry's rise to the throne as Henry VII in 1485. Yet while her political maneuvering is well documented, Margaret's intellectual and cultural influence is equally significant. Margaret was a deeply religious woman whose faith shaped much of her public work. Her commitment to the Church was not limited to personal piety, it extended into her patronage of theological education and literary production. She was a benefactor of religious institutions, endowing professorships and schools at both Oxford and Cambridge. The most famous of these are Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge, both of which still bear the marks of her generosity. Her investments in education were not merely philanthropic, they were ideological. Margaret saw learning, particularly religious learning, as a pathway to moral governance and divine favor. Through her endowments, she helped promote a new class of educated clergy and scholars, including women indirectly through the promotion of devotional texts accessible to lay readers. Margaret Beaufort's role in the history of English printing is perhaps one of her most important cultural legacies. She was a key patron of William Caxton, the pioneering printer who introduced and expanded the use of the printing press in England. Her support of Caxton included commissions for devotional and theological works, which reflected her interests in vernacular religious education. Notably, she commissioned the translation and printing of the Imitation of Christ, attributed to Thomas à Kempis, and the Mirror of Gold for the Sinful Soul, works that were widely read by women and aligned with her conservative Catholic values. These texts emphasized inner reflection, humility, and Christ-like suffering, ideals that Margaret embodied in both personal hardship and public action. In addition to supporting male scholars and printers, Margaret also backed translations by and for women. Though she did not write her own theological treatises, she actively encouraged the dissemination of texts that would form the backbone of women's devotional reading. Her choice to focus on translation was strategic. It allowed for the spread of orthodoxy without requiring original theological authorship, which might have been deemed inappropriate for women. Yet through these acts of commissioning and sponsoring, Margaret shaped the spiritual vocabulary of a generation. Moreover, Margaret carefully curated her image as a pious, learned, and devout woman, even signing her correspondence as Margaret R. Richmond. This signature, with its regal simplicity, underscored her political gravitas while emphasizing a tone of moral authority. In letters and dedications, she was often addressed with deference normally reserved for reigning monarchs. The deference shown to her was not merely due to her position as the king's mother, but also as a patroness of learning and virtue. Her court became a model of female-led piety and influence. Margaret's patronage and intellectual legacy influenced a number of key Tudor women who followed. Katherine Parr, Lady Jane Grey, and even Elizabeth I inherited a cultural environment shaped in part by Margaret's efforts to legitimize and promote women's education. The devotional books that Margaret commissioned were likely read and internalized by these later women, who would go on to write their own texts. In this sense, Margaret was not only a founder of a dynasty but a founder of a female literary tradition rooted in religious education and cultural stewardship. Despite operating within the strict patriarchal confines of late medieval England, Margaret Beaufort wielded her power with deliberate intelligence. Her patronage of the press, her commitment to religious scholarship, and her careful construction of her public persona all point to a woman who understood the value of the written word, not just as a personal exercise but as a form of legacy and influence. Though her name does not appear as an author in many printed works, her hand shaped much of what was read, studied, and believed by the Tudor elite. In this way, Margaret Beaufort truly pioneered the power of the pen, not by writing with it, but by ensuring that others could, and did. Margaret Roper, 1505–1544. Margaret Roper, daughter of Sir Thomas More, occupies a revered place in the intellectual and literary culture of early Tudor England. Living in an age when women were often barred from public scholarly recognition, Margaret defied convention through her remarkable education, refined linguistic skill, and quiet but lasting literary legacy. Though she published little during her lifetime, her translation of the Lord's Prayer and her status as a model of learned femininity offer crucial insight into how elite women used writing to shape identity, familial duty, and moral discourse within the courtly and religious life of Tudor society. Margaret Roper grew up in a household that functioned as a humanist microcosm. Her father, Thomas More, lawyer, author of Utopia and future Lord Chancellor, was one of England's most prominent Renaissance humanists. A firm believer in the power of education, he ensured that his daughters received the same rigorous instruction as his sons, a radical position in early 16th century England. Margaret, the eldest of More's children, excelled in Latin, Greek, philosophy, and theology and was widely recognized for her intellectual gifts. Her education was largely conducted within the home under the supervision of private tutors and More himself. She studied classical authors like Cicero and Seneca, as well as early Christian writers. More's commitment to educating his daughters, particularly Margaret, was not merely experimental or sentimental. It was a conscious embodiment of humanist values that prioritized virtue, eloquence, and moral development. He saw Margaret as a living testament to the argument that women, when properly instructed, could equal men in learning and wisdom. Margaret's most well-known literary accomplishment is her translation of Erasmus's. The original Latin treatise by Erasmus was an extended theological meditation on the Lord's Prayer. Margaret's English rendering was elegant and faithful, showcasing not only her linguistic fluency but also her spiritual acumen. The translation was never officially published in her lifetime, likely out of modesty and adherence to gender norms, but it circulated in manuscript form among elite readers. The work represented more than just a linguistic exercise. It was an act of devotional interpretation and a reflection of her intellectual engagement with the leading theological thinker of her day. The significance of this translation lies in its multiple dimensions. On one level, it is a theological reflection, part of the broader movement of lay piety that characterized early Tudor religious life. On another, it was an assertion of female capability within a traditionally male intellectual sphere. Translating Erasmus, who had himself argued for female education, aligned Margaret with the progressive wing of humanist thought, reinforcing the argument that virtue and intellect were not the sole preserve of men. In this way, Margaret contributed, quietly but definitively, to the evolving discussion about gender, education, and authorship. Margaret's literary life was deeply intertwined with her role as a daughter and moral confidant. Nowhere is this more evident than in her preservation of her father's letters and final writings. During Thomas More's imprisonment in the Tower of London from 1534 to 1535, Margaret maintained regular correspondence with him, often delivering messages, manuscripts, and even visiting in person. These letters are not mere family communications. They are rich philosophical and emotional exchanges, grappling with conscience, loyalty, and the forthcoming threat of death. More entrusted Margaret with the safekeeping of his final writings, including a dialogue of comfort against tribulation, and portions of the Sadness of Christ, which he composed in prison. That he placed this trust in her speaks not only to their close personal bond but also to her scholarly reliability and discretion. She became the guardian of his legacy, and her role in preserving his works cannot be overstated. It was through her efforts that much of his intellectual output during those final years was eventually disseminated. Margaret's courage and loyalty were further underscored by a famous incident following her father's execution in 1535. She retrieved and preserved his head, which had been displayed on a pike on London Bridge, a dangerous and emotionally harrowing act. This action, while not literary in itself, has been read symbolically as the ultimate expression of filial devotion and moral resistance. It highlighted her capacity for sacrifice and her active role in shaping how her father's martyrdom was remembered. Margaret Roper's legacy rests on more than her translation or familial devotion. She became an icon of domestic virtue fused with intellectual prowess. Later Protestant and Catholic writers alike idealized her as the embodiment of learned piety. She was frequently referenced in debates about women's education and used as a standard by which future generations of female scholars were measured. Her life demonstrated that it was possible to reconcile scholarly ambition with feminine modesty, and her model would influence women like Katherine Parr and Lady Jane Grey, who engaged in their own theological and literary endeavors. Moreover, the Roper household became a site of literary culture in its own right. After marrying William Roper, a biographer of Thomas More, Margaret continued to cultivate a home environment grounded in learning and religious reflection. Her children were educated in much the same spirit as she had been, and the manuscripts and books that circulated within her circle became part of a broader cultural network that included court figures, theologians, and humanists. Though Margaret Roper's output was modest in quantity, its quality and symbolic weight were enormous. She represented a fusion of humanist ideals and domestic womanhood at a time when women were rarely afforded a public intellectual identity. Her translation of Erasmus was not merely a literary feat, it was a cultural statement. Her efforts to preserve her father's writings were not simply acts of devotion, they were acts of archival resistance. Through her life and work, Margaret Roper advanced the position of women in the literary and intellectual life of Tudor England, quietly establishing herself as a pioneer of the pen whose influence echoed far beyond the confines of her manuscript pages. Anne Boleyn, 1501–1536. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII and mother of Elizabeth I, is remembered primarily for her dramatic rise and fall within the Tudor court. Yet beneath the legend lies a figure of considerable cultural sophistication and literary influence. Though only a small number of her writings survive, and was deeply engaged in the intellectual and religious currents of her time, using the written word, through letters, patronage and ideological messaging, to shape courtly culture, influence the English Reformation, and assert her identity as both queen and reformer. Her literary legacy, while subtle, is deeply woven into the transformation of England's religious and political landscape. Anne's early life laid the foundation for her literary and cultural awareness. Raised partly in the Netherlands and at the French court of Margaret of Austria and later Queen Claude, and was immersed in Renaissance humanism, courtly sophistication, and religious reformist thought from a young age. Her education was exceptional for a woman of her time. She learned French, Latin, some Greek, music, poetry, and rhetoric. This exposure to the intellectual elite of Europe imbued her with the values of the polished courtier, but also with a strong sense of how culture, and specifically writing, could be used for persuasion and influence. Upon her return to England and eventual ascent to the role of queen consort, and cultivated an image of herself that was heavily invested in reformist ideals. She aligned herself with humanist scholars and Protestant thinkers, many of whom were writing treatises calling for a more personal and scriptural-based Christianity. Anne's patronage of religious writers and translators was strategic and influential. She supported figures such as William Tyndale and Thomas Cranmer, and was instrumental in promoting the distribution of vernacular Bibles and theological writings. She owned a personal copy of Tyndale's English New Testament, which was banned at the time, and reportedly shared it with members of the court. While she did not publish theological tracts herself, and used the material she commissioned and circulated as a tool of ideological reform. Through these books and manuscripts, she subtly challenged the traditional authority of the Church and promoted a vision of faith that empowered lay people, especially women, to engage directly with Scripture. Her influence extended to the shaping of Henry VIII's own religious thinking, particularly during the period of his break with Rome and the foundation of the Church of England. The fact that Anne's influence coincided with such seismic shifts in English religious life underscores her indirect but pivotal literary agency, and also played a critical role in the literary culture of the court through her patronage of poets, translators, and musicians. She helped foster a circle of writers who produced texts that blended courtly love, religious contemplation, and political allegory. Her position at court transformed the role of the queen consort into a cultural patron. Anne's tastes were known to be refined and cosmopolitan, and her favor could determine a writer's or musician's prominence. This made her court a vibrant center of Renaissance expression and reformist thought. Of Anne Boleyn's writings, only fragments remain, most notably a small number of personal letters and annotations in devotional books. Her letters to Henry VIII, written during their long courtship, provide valuable insight into her emotional intelligence, wit, and rhetorical skill. These letters, though few, illustrate a woman keenly aware of her position, desirous of maintaining dignity while navigating the precarious politics of royal affection. She combines charm with formality, flirtation with political acumen, in ways that reflect a strong command of written tone and purpose. One of the most compelling examples of Anne's relationship with text is a book of hours she owned, which contains marginal inscriptions in her handwriting. In one copy, she wrote a message to one of her ladies-in-waiting, demonstrating not only her intimacy with the devotional book but also her use of it as a medium for personal communication. In this way, Anne transformed a religious object into a space for written female connection, a subtle yet meaningful act in a time when women's voices were often limited to the private sphere. Anne's cultural and ideological legacy would ultimately outlast her brief reign. Her death, the result of charges widely believed to be fabricated, halted her political and religious influence abruptly. Yet the seeds she had sown, in the form of reformist texts, the legitimization of female literacy and patronage, and the cultural foundation she laid for her daughter, continued to grow. Elizabeth I's intellectual formation and literary sophistication owe much to Anne's courtly model. Anne's vision of a learned, devout, and rhetorically skilled woman came to full expression in Elizabeth's reign. Furthermore, Anne's own mythos became a subject of literary fascination. Subsequent generations would revisit her story in plays, poems, and pamphlets, often debating her role as either tragic heroine or heretic queen. Even in death, her legacy was constructed and reconstructed through writing. Her life became a touchstone for discussions about female power, sexuality, religious reform, and the precariousness of courtly favor, all conveyed through various literary modes. Anne Boleyn's contribution to Tudor literary culture lies not in prolific authorship but in strategic patronage, personal writing, and cultural modeling. She understood the importance of the written word, not just as a means of personal expression, but as a vehicle for influence, identity, and reform. Her role in nurturing an English Protestant literary tradition, supporting the translation of religious texts, and asserting a female intellectual presence at court positions her as one of the era's most dynamic and influential women writers, not through the quantity of her writings, but through the lasting impact of her engagement with the pen. Katherine Parr, 1512–1548. Katherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, holds the unique distinction of being the first woman in England to publish a book under her name in English. Her literary achievements were not simply anomalies of circumstance, but the result of deliberate engagement with theological debate, reformist discourse, and a growing awareness of the power of authorship. Katherine Parr's writing career, intertwined with her role as queen consort, reveals the ways in which noble and royal women could navigate political danger and spiritual authority through the written word. Born into the noble Parr family, Katherine was well educated by the standards of the time. She learned Latin, French, and some Italian, and had a lifelong affinity for reading, especially religious texts. Her humanist education, likely influenced by her mother and later tutors, was shaped by the growing Protestant Reformation and the humanist emphasis on moral philosophy and piety. This intellectual formation positioned her to play an influential role in both the court and religious life of Tudor England. Katherine married Henry VIII in 1543, becoming his sixth wife and outliving him by a year. By the time she entered the royal household, she had already experienced 2 marriages and was recognized for her maturity, intelligence, and dignity. Unlike some of her predecessors, Katherine approached queenship with a strong sense of duty and moral responsibility. Her role as stepmother to Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, would prove particularly significant. She acted as a moral and educational guide, especially to the young Elizabeth, fostering an environment of learning and encouraging engagement with religious and literary texts. Katherine's most significant contributions to Tudor literary culture came through her publications. In 1545, she published Prayers or Meditations, a devotional text adapted from Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ. This was a landmark moment. Never before had an English queen published a book under her name. The text was widely circulated and reprinted multiple times, indicating its popularity and influence. Prayers or Meditations focused on personal piety, inner reflection, and a direct relationship with God, tenets in line with Protestant devotional trends. The text appealed to a broad readership, offering English readers a vernacular spiritual resource in an age of religious uncertainty. 2 years later, in 1547, she published The Lamentation of a Sinner, a far more radical and personal work. This text marked a departure from the more neutral tone of her earlier publication, embracing evangelical doctrine and advocating for justification by faith, one of the core tenets of Protestant theology. Written in the first person, The Lamentation reads as a spiritual autobiography, tracing her journey from worldly distraction to divine enlightenment. It also subtly critiques the Catholic sacramental system and promotes the idea of grace over works, aligning Catherine with the more reformist factions of English Protestantism. Publishing such a theologically assertive work while married to Henry VIII, a monarch known for his fluctuating religious positions and brutal enforcement of conformity, was risky. Henry had already executed individuals, including women, for holding what were deemed heretical beliefs. Catherine's boldness in writing and publishing The Lamentation reflects both her conviction and her calculated understanding of how the printed word could function as a spiritual and political statement. She walked a delicate line, asserting her voice as a religious thinker while maintaining the image of the obedient and virtuous queen. Her relationship with the Protestant cause extended beyond her writings. Catherine fostered a household filled with reform-minded scholars, writers, and educators. She protected and supported religious radicals, including those fleeing persecution from abroad. She also collected and distributed Protestant books and likely had access to banned translations of the Bible. Catherine was more than a reader, she was a curator of reformist thought, building a network of correspondence and theological exchange that helped lay the intellectual groundwork for the Elizabethan religious settlement that would follow. Her influence on the young Elizabeth was particularly profound. Catherine acted as a mother figure and intellectual mentor, encouraging her stepdaughter's studies in languages, theology, and literature. Elizabeth's fluency in multiple languages, her translation work, and her rhetorical mastery as queen all owe a debt to the cultural and intellectual environment Catherine cultivated. It is not a stretch to argue that Katherine Parr served as a prototype for the learned, articulate, and politically astute female monarch Elizabeth would become. Catherine's final years were marked by continued engagement with religious scholarship. After Henry died in 1547, she married Thomas Seymour, with whom she established a household known for its intellectual vibrancy. Even while pregnant with her first child, Catherine continued her writing and maintained correspondence with religious thinkers. Tragically, she died in childbirth in 1548, but her literary and spiritual legacy endured. Katherine Parr's life and work demonstrate how the pen could be used to assert authority, convey piety, and shape public discourse, even for a woman at the apex of patriarchal power structures. Her ability to publish under her name marked a breakthrough in gendered authorship, asserting a form of moral and theological leadership previously unavailable to women. Her writings are neither passive reflections nor mere devotions. They are active contributions to England's religious transformation and a challenge to the notion that women should remain silent on spiritual or political matters. In a time when women's public voices were limited and often suspect, Katherine Parr made hers heard through careful, calculated, and deeply personal engagement with the written word. She turned the Queen's Prayer Book into a public theological declaration and her spiritual reflections into a printed legacy. Her influence resonated beyond her life, informing both the intellectual development of Elizabeth I and the broader movement toward female literacy, authorship, and religious reform. As such, Katherine Parr stands not just as a queen who wrote, but as a writer who redefined queenship through the power of the pen. Lady Jane Grey, 1537 and 1554. Lady Jane Grey, remembered in popular history as the 9 Days Queen, was far more than a tragic political pawn. Though her reign as queen was fleeting, her intellectual prowess, humanist education, and surviving writings place her firmly among the most remarkable literary women of the Tudor era. Jane's life reveals the complex intersections of gender, education, religion, and politics, and how literacy and the written word became essential tools for expressing resistance, piety, and personal identity, even in the face of execution. Born into the influential Grey and Brandon families, Jane was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII and thus had a legitimate, though politically contested, claim to the English throne. From a very young age, she was groomed to be a highly educated noblewoman. Under the guidance of elite humanist tutors, including John Aylmer and potentially Roger Ascham, Jane received an education that rivaled that of any male counterpart in her time. She became fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian, read the works of Plato, Cicero, and the Church Fathers, and engaged deeply with theological texts. Her education was not merely ornamental. It reflected a deliberate commitment to Protestant intellectual culture and reformist piety. Jane's letters and recorded conversations, particularly during her captivity, show a young woman of exceptional clarity, moral strength, and theological sophistication. Far from being a passive victim of court intrigue, Jane used her literacy and education to assert her beliefs and construct her legacy. Her writing, especially the letter to her younger sister Catherine Grey and her dialogue with John Feckenham, the Queen's Catholic chaplain, demonstrates not only her scriptural knowledge but also her skill in persuasion, moral reasoning, and rhetorical strategy. Perhaps the most well-known example of Jane's writing is her letter to Catherine, written shortly before her execution. In this powerful document, Jane does not dwell on the injustice of her fate or seek pity. Instead, she transforms her suffering into a religious and didactic message. She urges Catherine to value spiritual truths over worldly success, warning her against the temptations of vanity, ambition, and idolatry. This letter reads like a miniature sermon, steeped in Protestant theology and rich in scriptural allusion. It reflects Jane's deep internalization of reformist doctrine, particularly the belief in salvation through faith alone, and her desire to pass on this moral and religious instruction as part of her final act. The letter is notable for its emotional restraint, clarity of thought, and moral authority. Jane does not speak as a frightened adolescent but as a preacher of the gospel, using her education and her final hours to leave behind a document of spiritual conviction. In doing so, she claims a voice and agency that few women of her age and rank were permitted. The letter operates simultaneously as a private expression of sisterly love, a public declaration of Protestant belief, and a self-authored epitaph. Jane's dialogue with Feckenham, who was sent by Queen Mary I to persuade her to recant her Protestant faith, is another key piece of evidence for her literary and theological stature. In their exchange, recorded by sympathetic Protestant sources, Jane counters Feckenham's arguments with scriptural citations and rational, composed responses. While the authenticity and precise wording of this account may be shaped by posthumous editorializing, the portrait it presents aligns with other contemporary descriptions of Jane's learning and character. Even under the shadow of death, she held firm to her beliefs and used the tools of her education to challenge Catholic orthodoxy. Jane's engagement with writing extended beyond theological debate. Her correspondence shows evidence of literary flair, stylistic precision, and rhetorical training grounded in the humanist tradition. She demonstrates the classical influence of figures like Cicero and Seneca, combining their emphasis on moral virtue and public responsibility with distinctly Christian themes of martyrdom and divine providence. Her education enabled her to inhabit the role of philosopher as well as confessor, a young woman who saw herself not as a political figurehead but as a vessel for spiritual truth. Jane's literary legacy, though tragically brief, played an important symbolic role in the Protestant imagination. In the decades following her execution, she was portrayed as a Protestant martyr, an English Antigone who chose conscience over compromise. Her writings were published and circulated as evidence of youthful wisdom and godly devotion, used to inspire future generations of Protestant readers, particularly women. The ideal of Jane Grey as the scholarly, virtuous, and courageous young woman was invoked throughout the Elizabethan era, shaping expectations for educated Protestant womanhood. Moreover, her example reinforced the value of classical and religious education for noblewomen. She embodied the argument, advanced by earlier figures such as Margaret Roper and Katherine Parr, that women could and should participate in serious intellectual and spiritual discourse. Jane did not write for fame or for political gain. Indeed, her writings are devoid of self-aggrandizement. She wrote to understand, to resist, to teach, and ultimately to bear witness to her faith. Her brief rule and tragic end often obscure the extent to which Jane Grey used the written word to define herself against the forces that tried to silence her. In an environment that treated young noblewomen as bargaining chips in dynastic and religious politics, Jane insisted on speaking her mind eloquently and faithfully. Her legacy lives not only in her letters and dialogues but in the idea that even the most constrained and endangered of women could wield the pen as a form of power. Mary I, 1516 and 1558. Mary I, England's first queen regnant, is often remembered by the epithet Bloody Mary, a label that distorts the complexity of her character and legacy. While her reign was marked by religious persecution, it also demonstrated the evolving power of written language in governance, diplomacy, and personal identity, especially in the hands of a ruling woman. Mary's use of writing, particularly through proclamations, letters, and religious polemic, illustrates how she asserted legitimacy, communicated piety, and navigated both personal and political crises in a volatile religious landscape. Her written voice, though less literary than that of her half-sister Elizabeth I or predecessors Katherine Parr, reveals a woman deeply engaged with the written word as a tool of monarchical authority and personal faith. From an early age, Mary was educated in the humanist tradition, as befitting the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. She was fluent in Latin and conversant in French and Spanish. Her education included study of classical literature, music, theology, and history, subjects that reflected the Renaissance belief in the moral and intellectual formation of noble minds. While her later writings do not display overt humanist flourishes or literary artistry, this early foundation helped shape her command of formal rhetoric and her understanding of how language could be used to assert both personal dignity and sovereign will. Mary's letters from her youth, especially during the tumultuous years of her father's divorce and England's religious upheaval, show a young woman of great emotional restraint and political awareness. As her status shifted from princess to illegitimate daughter and back again, Mary used letter writing to assert her identity and petition for her rights. These letters often walk a careful line, respectful and obedient on the surface, yet embedded with coded resistance to the political and religious forces seeking to erase her legitimacy. In a particularly striking letter to Thomas Cromwell in 1536, Mary pleads for her father's forgiveness but refuses to renounce her mother's marriage as invalid, an act of defiance cloaked in submission. This dual tone, formal deference coupled with ideological resistance, became a hallmark of Mary's written voice. Her letters to ambassadors, foreign rulers, and domestic allies throughout her life, especially during her years of marginalization under Edward VI, reflect her strategic use of language to build alliances, assert religious orthodoxy, and maintain her claim to the throne. She understood that letter writing was more than communication. It was a performative act of self-presentation and political negotiation. When she ascended the throne in 1553, Mary confronted a realm divided by years of Protestant reform. Her first actions as queen were not military or theatrical but rhetorical, proclamations and official letters that reasserted Catholic orthodoxy, affirmed her legitimacy, and demanded obedience. Her written proclamations reveal a monarch keenly aware of the power of language to stabilize authority. These documents were formal, commanding, and carefully constructed to invoke divine sanction, the law of succession, and historical precedent. In contrast to the literary richness of Elizabeth I's later speeches, Mary's public rhetoric was more severe and direct. But this severity suited her purpose, to convey unambiguous royal authority and moral clarity at a time of national uncertainty. One of her most famous proclamations, issued upon her accession, reaffirmed her Catholic faith and her commitment to restoring true religion. She did not appeal to sentiment or artistry but to justice, continuity, and divine order, concepts rooted in Catholic political theology. Mary's religious convictions permeated her writing. She saw her role not just as a political ruler but as a spiritual restorer. In this sense, her letters and proclamations can be read as a form of religious testimony, emphasizing themes of obedience, repentance, and divine retribution. Though Mary did not write theological treatises herself, she supported the publication of polemical tracts and Catholic apologetic, commissioning sermons and translations that supported her counter-Reformation policies. She also maintained correspondence with the papacy and leading Catholic rulers, in which she asserted both doctrinal orthodoxy and diplomatic intent. Mary's private letters, particularly those exchanged with her husband Philip II of Spain, reveal another side of her written identity. In them she expressed longing, vulnerability, and loyalty, sometimes bordering on desperation. These letters show a woman struggling with the burdens of rule, the expectations of marriage, and the failure to produce an heir. Her writing in these moments is deeply human, revealing the emotional cost of her political position. Unlike the calculated grandeur of her proclamations, these private correspondences reflect a personal voice, tentative, anxious, and devout. Her final writings, including a will-like statement made near her death in 1558, reaffirm her Catholic piety and sense of divine mission. She expressed hope that her successor would continue the religious restoration she had begun, though her faith in Elizabeth's orthodoxy was misplaced. Her words in these final acts are less about regret than continuity. They serve as her final prayer and testament, as though through writing she could imprint her soul upon the English body politic. Despite the negative historical perception shaped by Protestant historians and later popular culture, Mary I's use of writing reflects a keen understanding of the power of the written word. She used letters and proclamations not to charm or perform, but to command and defend. Her words were extensions of her monarchy, instruments of religious duty, and bulwarks against the erosion of her vision of England. Mary's writings, though often overshadowed by the eloquence of Elizabeth I or the spiritual passion of Lady Jane Grey, deserve recognition in the context of Tudor literary and political culture. They offer insight into a woman of profound conviction, navigating a throne earned through birthright but contested by ideology. In a period when women's authority was scrutinized and fragile, Mary's pen, formal, fervent, and unflinching, remains a testament to her resolve and reign. Elizabeth I, 1533 and 1603. Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Boleyn, remains one of the most rhetorically skilled monarchs in English history. Her mastery of language, whether in public speeches, private letters, or poetic reflections, was not only a personal strength but a deliberate political tool. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Elizabeth understood and wielded the written word as a means to craft her identity, assert authority, and unify a deeply divided nation. As the last Tudor monarch and a woman ruling in a male-dominated world, her words, spoken and written, became central to the mythos of the Elizabethan age and her survival. Elizabeth's early education was rigorous and thorough, shaped by the humanist traditions championed by her stepmother Katherine Parr and her tutors, including Roger Ascham. She became fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and had a reading knowledge of Spanish. This linguistic skill granted her access to classical texts, European political theory, and the theological arguments that underpinned the Protestant Reformation. She not only absorbed these ideas but learned to refashion them in her voice, adapting classical rhetorical models to her unique position as a woman and a monarch. Her earliest writings, such as letters composed during the reign of her brother Edward VI and her imprisonment under Mary I, show a cautious, calculated command of tone. These letters reveal how Elizabeth used her pen to protect herself. In her famous letter to Queen Mary in 1554, written from the Tower of London after being accused of conspiracy, Elizabeth combines humility, legalism, and emotional restraint to argue her innocence. She avoids overt claims to power or righteousness but subtly asserts her dignity and intelligence. This letter is a model of rhetorical prudence, written under mortal threat yet infused with self-possession. Once Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, she began to use her written and spoken words to craft a public persona unlike any other monarch. As a woman ruling alone, she faced immediate questions of legitimacy, strength, and femininity. Her speeches and proclamations responded to these concerns head-on. She spoke and wrote not merely as a political figure, but as a performer of power, shaping her monarchy through language. One of her most famous pieces of writing, the Golden Speech of 1601, exemplifies her rhetorical brilliance. Addressed to members of Parliament late in her reign, this speech combines humility, devotion, and subtle authority. Elizabeth presents herself as a servant of the people, a queen whose wealth lies not in gold but in the love of her subjects. "Though God hath raised me high," she declares, "yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves." These carefully chosen words reinforce her image as a benevolent, almost maternal ruler, while reminding her audience of her spiritual and moral authority. The speech demonstrates how Elizabeth turned emotional resonance into political capital. Her letters to foreign rulers and ambassadors similarly reveal her control over tone and content. With Philip II of Spain, her former suitor and later adversary, Elizabeth's letters moved between diplomatic courtesy and steely resolve. She wrote with a keen awareness of how language could be used to delay, persuade, and mislead, often buying time or softening tensions through eloquent ambiguity. Her diplomatic correspondence was not just functional but performative. Each letter was an act of negotiation, self-presentation, and power assertion. Elizabeth also used poetry as a medium for private reflection and political messaging. Though she was not a prolific poet, her surviving verses, such as On Monsieur's Departure, and her meditations on mortality and kingship, show a capacity for emotional depth and literary style. These poems explore the tensions between her personal desires and her public duties, between vulnerability and strength. In On Monsieur's Departure, likely written after the collapse of marriage negotiations with the Duke of Anjou, she expresses sorrow and restraint, crafting a narrative of romantic self-denial that also reinforces her image as the Virgin Queen, wedded to her people, not to any man. The construction of this persona, wise, chaste, self-sacrificing, was one of Elizabeth's greatest rhetorical achievements. Through speeches, letters, and carefully managed public appearances, she transformed what could have been perceived as political weakness, her unmarried status, into a symbol of divine providence and national unity. Her body and voice became metaphors for the nation itself, a strategy reinforced by countless declarations, proclamations, and printed materials produced under her name. Elizabeth was also acutely aware of the power of print. Though many of her speeches were delivered orally, they were quickly transcribed, printed, and circulated, often revised to suit political goals. The print culture of her reign amplified her presence throughout the realm, allowing her words to reach a wider audience than any monarch before her. This was a strategic use of media. Elizabeth did not write everything herself, but she authorized and shaped what was disseminated, ensuring that her rhetoric matched her reign. Her final speech to Parliament in 1601 and her letters in the closing years of her reign express both triumph and weariness. In these writings, one senses a queen who knows the end is near but is still intent on defining the legacy she leaves behind. She continued to write and revise her messages until the end, ensuring that her image remained consistent, devout, just, beloved. Elizabeth's writings demonstrate that a monarch's authority could be as much about persuasion as decree. Her use of language was foundational to her rule and central to the construction of the Elizabethan state. She proved that words, carefully chosen, beautifully arranged, and strategically deployed, could be more potent than armies. Her speeches rallied troops, her proclamations shaped policy, and her letters managed crises. In an age when women were expected to remain silent or private, Elizabeth I wrote herself into power. Through letters, speeches, and poetic reflections, she transformed personal expression into public authority. Her reign was in many ways a testament to the political power of language, how it could build images, forge allegiances, and sustain an empire. More than a queen who ruled with words, Elizabeth I was a writer who redefined monarchy through the pen. For women in the Tudor court, writing was not merely a mechanical act but an assertion of selfhood and agency. In an era where female voices were often confined by societal and religious constraints, the variety of forms women employed to express themselves, from personal letters to devotional texts, reveals the resilience and creativity with which they navigated their cultural landscape. Each genre and medium allowed different degrees of visibility, influence, and intimacy, shaping how women could communicate their thoughts, beliefs, and identities. Letters stood as one of the most powerful tools in a woman's literary arsenal. Whether written for private, political, or religious reasons, these documents were crucial vehicles of expression. In a political context, letters enabled women to negotiate marriage, manage estates, influence court decisions, and participate in diplomacy. For instance, Elizabeth I's correspondence often conveyed intricate political maneuvering beneath a veneer of formality and grace. Women wrote to monarchs, foreign diplomats, family members, and friends, using language carefully modulated to reflect both their authority and their vulnerability. Even when constrained by social decorum, these letters could be subtly subversive, laden with persuasive rhetoric, appeals to emotion, or coded messages. Female handwriting itself took on meaning. It was often stylized and trained as part of a noblewoman's education, but it could also be used to reflect individuality and class. The way a woman shaped her letters, her spelling, penmanship, phrasing, formed a unique signature of identity, preserving not only her words but also the essence of her presence across time and space. Poetry at the Tudor court offered another realm in which women engaged as both muses and creators. Though court poets like Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, often wrote about women as idealized subjects of love or virtue, women themselves wrote poetry that reflected their inner lives, theological beliefs, and responses to their environments. Courtly performance was a collaborative and performative aspect of Tudor culture, and women actively participated in this sphere. Riddles, sonnets, and devotional verses composed by women reveal their skill in manipulating language and form. Manuscript culture was central to this kind of writing, as women's poems were frequently circulated in courtly coteries rather than printed. This allowed a controlled form of literary participation, where expression could be simultaneously shared and kept within trusted circles. The intimacy of manuscript circulation made poetry a powerful form for reflecting on love, piety, and personal struggle, while avoiding public scrutiny. Translation provided an important avenue for intellectual engagement and religious commentary. In a society where women were rarely permitted to speak from the pulpit or hold academic office, translation allowed them to engage with major theological and philosophical texts while asserting their literacy and interpretative authority. Translating texts from Latin, Greek, or continental vernaculars into English was not merely a linguistic exercise, it was a form of cultural transmission and political theology. Katherine Parr's translation and publication of religious texts, most notably her Prayers or Meditations, illustrated how translation became a form of doctrinal assertion and female piety. Women like Mary Sidney Herbert, Countess of Pembroke, engaged in translations that revealed not just spiritual devotion but also intellectual ambition. The act of translating texts often involved significant editorial decisions, shaping the meaning and tone of the original material. Access to languages was limited to elite women, typically those who received a humanist education, yet those who did often used their training to contribute to the religious reform and to subtly critique or reinforce prevailing ideologies. Translation in this context was both a demonstration of erudition and an assertion of interpretive control. Autobiographical writing, while less formalized in structure, was equally potent as a mode of self-expression. Prayer books, marginalia, personal reflections, and spiritual meditations gave women a private yet enduring literary voice. These writings often survive in the form of annotations, notes in the margins of religious texts, or handwritten devotional manuscripts. Such material captures the depth of personal piety and philosophical inquiry pursued by women in solitude or within their domestic spheres. Lady Jane Grey's surviving letters from captivity, as well as an Askew's confessional accounts in the Examinations, illustrate how autobiographical writing could also function as a record of resistance and testimony. These documents provide first-hand accounts of emotional resilience, spiritual certainty, and the struggle for ideological integrity. In moments of crisis, whether facing execution, exile, or imprisonment, writing allowed these women to articulate a coherent narrative of their beliefs and personhood. The diversity of literary forms employed by Tudor women reflects the spectrum of roles they inhabited and the varying degrees of autonomy available to them. Whether through elegant court verse, sharp political correspondence, the careful crafting of a translated text, or heartfelt devotional writings, they made use of every available avenue to articulate a presence in a world that often sought to render them silent. Each form of expression carried with it unique possibilities and constraints, but all shared a common thread. They preserved the intellectual and emotional legacies of women who were keenly aware of the power inherent in the written word. Eventually, these forms of writing enabled women to transcend the limitations of their immediate circumstances. They created networks of influence, fostered relationships across social and national boundaries, and built repositories of spiritual and emotional reflection that continue to inform our understanding of female experience in the Tudor period. Their writings are not just historical artifacts. They are enduring testaments to the richness of women's inner lives and their unyielding pursuit of voice and visibility through the pen. In the richly stratified world of the Tudor court, women did not only participate as writers, they also played indispensable roles as patrons, muses, and literary subjects. These roles were interlinked and instrumental in shaping the literary output of the period. Although much of the literary culture was male-dominated, women found meaningful ways to exert influence, support creative endeavors, and become central figures within literary narratives. Through their patronage, their presence in literature, and the very way their queenship was constructed and performed in text, Tudor women helped mold the cultural consciousness of the period. The first and perhaps most direct way in which women influenced the literary world was through patronage networks. Noblewomen, queens, and ladies-in-waiting frequently funded the publication of books, supported individual writers, and maintained households that doubled as centers of literary production and exchange. These households served as informal salons where ideas were debated, texts were read aloud, and manuscripts were circulated. Women such as Katherine Parr and Elizabeth I did not merely receive books. They commissioned, edited, and sometimes authored them. Their support could secure a writer's livelihood or elevate a printer's reputation, granting them visibility and status in the crowded world of Tudor letters. This economic and cultural sponsorship positioned women as vital arbiters of taste and ideology. Katherine Parr, in particular, stands out as a literary sponsor who also wrote and translated her own works. Yet beyond her personal authorship, she nurtured a household steeped in learning, attracting scholars, tutors, and Protestant thinkers. Her stepdaughter Elizabeth absorbed this culture of intellectual pursuit and went on to become an influential literary figure in her own right. Parr's promotion of religious works also reflects how women's patronage could shape the theological discourse of the Reformation, steering religious ideology through the selection and dissemination of texts. The Elizabethan court further illustrates how royal women could elevate the arts. Elizabeth I, both a writer and a patron, encouraged a flourishing literary environment. She inspired a genre of courtly literature that sought to praise, advise, and sometimes critique her through allegory and metaphor. Writers like Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney navigated a delicate balance between reverence and ambition in their dedications to the Queen. Her court became not only a political hub but also a literary stage where patronage and poetic homage intersected. Women were also frequently the subjects of literary works, sometimes as idealized abstractions, other times as figures of power, piety, or temptation. Court poets such as Wyatt and Surrey wrote poems that elevated women to the heights of courtly love or lamented their fickleness. These poetic constructions reflected the societal gaze upon women, framing them within narratives of beauty, virtue, or unattainability. This act of writing about women helped shape public perceptions and in some cases, reinforced or challenged existing gender norms. Yet the gap between literary depiction and lived experience was often vast. The stylized woman in a sonnet bore little resemblance to the politically astute and rhetorically skilled queen on the throne. Even within idealization, however, there was space for complexity. A woman might be the muse but also subtly manipulate how she was portrayed through her actions, her dress, or her own writings. Women who were written about were never merely passive. They influenced the nature of their representation through their conduct, correspondence, and political choices. Queens, in particular, were more than just subjects of literature. They became political texts themselves. Their reigns and identities were constructed, contested, and performed through a range of written forms, from coronation books to diplomatic letters and ceremonial pageantry. A queen's body was both literal and symbolic, a vessel of succession, a marker of national identity, and a site of religious contention. Writers and courtiers carefully curated the image of queens through prefaces, dedications, and elaborate textual tributes. Elizabeth I was perhaps the most self-conscious of these textual queens. She actively engaged in self-fashioning through her speeches, poems, and proclamations, portraying herself variously as a virgin, a mother to her people, or a warrior queen. Her image was shaped not only by her pen but by the pens of those who surrounded her. Coronation books and pageants framed her rule in mythic terms, blending classical, biblical, and chivalric imagery to solidify her authority. These were not merely celebratory, they were political instruments crafted to manage perception and project power. The interplay between the symbolic and the real in queenship reveals how textual production was a form of governance. Language shaped loyalty. Imagery molded ideology. A queen's ability to control or inspire the texts around her was crucial to maintaining authority in a male-dominated system of rule. Women of the court understood this and participated in it, whether by endorsing a book, serving as dedicates, or performing in court masques. The roles of women as patrons, muses, and literary subjects were not peripheral, they were central to the literary and political fabric of the Tudor court. Through their financial support, their inspiration, and their strategic performance within literary traditions, women helped shape the contours of English Renaissance literature. Their influence extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the court and continues to challenge our understanding of authorship, power, and representation in early modern England. Throughout the Tudor era, moments of political, religious, and personal crisis became critical junctures where women wielded writing as a tool of resilience, identity, and influence. At times of heightened vulnerability, whether during imprisonment, exile, martyrdom, or dynastic uncertainty, the written word became a lifeline. It allowed women not only to assert their beliefs and loyalties but also to frame their narratives in ways that defied erasure or misinterpretation by others. These moments illuminate the potent intersections of gender, power, and authorship under the most trying of conditions. Imprisonment and exile were often the settings for some of the most poignant and strategic writings by women in the Tudor period. The Tower of London, a notorious site of confinement, bore witness to the intellectual fortitude of several women who used their pens to communicate resilience, devotion, and agency. Lady Jane Grey, imprisoned and later executed for her brief reign, left behind letters of extraordinary clarity and theological sophistication. Her correspondence to her sister Catherine offers both moral guidance and an enduring statement of Protestant conviction. Despite her youth and the intense pressures upon her, Jane used writing to establish control over her legacy, transforming from political pawn into Protestant martyr through the force of her words. Mary Queen of Scots similarly turned to the pen during her long years of captivity in England. Though a rival to Elizabeth I and a focal point of Catholic intrigue, her letters exhibit a complex emotional and political calculus. She appealed to familial loyalty, dynastic rights, and religious solidarity, crafting letters not only for negotiation but also as a form of self-preservation. Even under constant surveillance, Mary used her writing to influence her supporters and frame herself as a legitimate queen and wronged woman. These texts, often written in cipher or with cautionary phrasing, reflect the tension between intimacy and caution under conditions of scrutiny. Religious martyrdom provided another crucible for female authorship, particularly in the case of Anne Askew. A committed Protestant, Askew was interrogated and tortured for her beliefs during the reign of Henry VIII. Her writings, preserved as the Examinations, are among the most compelling records of female defiance in the face of persecution. Askew's calm yet forceful rhetoric, her theological certainty, and her articulate responses to male interrogators stand as a testament to the intellectual and spiritual power women could exercise through writing. Her account was later edited and published by reformist sympathizers, amplifying her story as a piece of Protestant propaganda. In this way, Askew's suffering was not only a personal ordeal but also a public spectacle of resistance. Martyrdom writings often served dual purposes: private testimony and political polemic. Women who articulated their faith under the threat of death did so with an awareness of the broader implications of their words. They became symbolic figures and their writings tools of ideological warfare. Gender compounded the resonance of their stories. A woman's steadfastness in the face of suffering was framed as both spiritual heroism and proof of divine endorsement. Thus, the act of writing became both a spiritual discipline and a political act, reshaping public discourse on piety, legitimacy, and resistance. Another domain where female writing intersected with crisis was the sphere of marriage and succession. For women of royal or noble birth, the question of whom to marry was not a private affair but a dynastic and diplomatic calculation. Letters concerning marriage negotiations, rejections, or persuasions were often loaded with strategic ambiguity. Elizabeth I's deft use of correspondence to manage marriage proposals from foreign princes and English nobles alike illustrates her mastery of language as a means of maintaining sovereign authority. She managed to keep potential alliances in play without committing, using carefully chosen words to assert her autonomy while appeasing suitors and diplomats. Writing in this context became a tool for controlling one's narrative and reputation. Elizabeth framed herself as both desirable and independent, weaving personal and national interests into a seamless rhetorical posture. Her letters, along with speeches and proclamations, allowed her to perform queenship on her terms, resisting the reduction of her role to that of wife or consort. She redefined royal femininity by using the pen as a scepter, conducting diplomacy not only in chambers but on parchment. Beyond Elizabeth, other noblewomen engaged in epistolary negotiations that revealed their political acumen. Letters to or from potential husbands, suitors, or royal advisors reveal the calculated ways in which women communicated consent, dissent, or maneuvered around constraints. Writing allowed them to participate in court politics even when formal channels of power were closed to them. These texts often balanced deference with assertion, appealing to social expectations while subtly challenging them. Across all these moments of crisis, be it incarceration, doctrinal persecution, or marital diplomacy, writing offered Tudor women a means to preserve their dignity, shape their stories, and influence outcomes. It allowed them to endure, to protest, to plead, and to inspire. Though many of their writings were initially meant for private eyes or limited circulation, their survival and later publication transformed them into public artifacts of remarkable significance. The consistency with which women turned to writing during times of duress underscores the medium's dual role as a form of personal reflection and public assertion. It was an act of endurance as much as expression, an effort to document truths in a world that often sought to suppress or distort them. Whether smuggled out of prison, passed through courtiers, or copied in secret, these texts became enduring monuments to courage and conviction. The crisis writings of Tudor women illuminate the deeply strategic and emotive uses of the written word. These were not simply cries of anguish or passive laments. They were deliberate constructions of identity, faith, and authority. In turning to the pen during moments of peril, Tudor women claimed a space in history that the sword, the church, or the court might have otherwise denied them. Their words endure as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound power of the written voice in shaping historical memory. In the literary culture of Tudor England, the physicality of the written word was inseparable from its meaning. For women writers, the material forms of their work, whether manuscript or print, signified access, intention, and legacy. The textures of ink and vellum, the margins filled with annotations, the carefully chosen bindings and illuminations, all became elements of self-expression and cultural identity. In a world where women's voices were often limited by law and custom, the material conditions of their writing were a subtle, potent field of resistance and authorship. The divide between manuscript and print defined much of the literary landscape in the 16th century. While the printing press had revolutionized the accessibility of texts, women's works were rarely printed during their lifetimes. Manuscript circulation, however, remained a dominant form of literary exchange, especially within elite households and courtly circles. Women often produced handwritten texts intended for private or semi-private audiences. This allowed for a degree of control over readership and reception that printed publication did not afford. Manuscripts could be adorned with illuminations, personalized dedications, and bindings that reflected the status and aesthetic tastes of both the author and recipient. These elements reinforced the social function of writing as a gift, a performance, or a negotiation. For example, prayer books might be lavishly decorated and bound in silk or velvet, symbolizing both spiritual devotion and worldly refinement. Female authors or patrons could commission such works as demonstrations of piety, intellect, and social standing. Annotations in women's books further reflect their intellectual engagement. Marginalia, notes, comments, and glosses offered women a way to insert their voice into male-authored texts. These marginal notes could be deeply personal, theological, or interpretive, allowing women to reframe existing texts to align with their own perspectives. Such interactions with texts transformed passive reading into active dialogue. A woman might challenge, affirm, or reinterpret scripture or humanist literature in the margins of her own library. The role of female-owned books in legacy and memory was significant. Books became heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, forming a chain of literacy and cultural transmission. These objects were often inscribed with the owner's name, motto, or even lineage, rooting them within familial and dynastic histories. Women's libraries, while often private and modest compared to male counterparts, served as repositories of knowledge, devotion, and identity. Ownership of books also conveyed a powerful visual message in portraiture. Tudor-era portraits of noblewomen often included a book, held in hand, placed on a desk, or open to a meaningful passage. These images reinforced the idea of feminine virtue intertwined with literacy and learning. They signaled not only the subject's education but also her moral and intellectual capacity. Such symbolic gestures were part of the broader performative nature of queenship and nobility in the Tudor court. The scarcity of printed works by women did not preclude their influence on print culture. Some women, such as Katherine Parr, navigated the male-dominated publishing world to bring their writings to broader audiences. Parr's Prayers or Meditations, and The Lamentation of a Sinner, were not only groundbreaking in their content and authorship but also in their printed form, which gave her voice a reach beyond manuscript circulation. She carefully curated dedications and textual framing to guide the reception of her work, showing that even in print, material context mattered deeply. Others, like Askew, saw their writings published posthumously, often through the efforts of sympathetic male editors or reformist printers. The framing of these texts, through prefaces, commentary, or marginalia, shaped how readers encountered and understood the female voice within. These paratextual elements either amplified the woman's agency or, in some cases, muted it under the guise of editorial authority. The question of who had access to Latin, Greek, and vernacular texts was also material. Books in foreign languages were often rare, expensive, and out of reach for many. Women who could read and write in multiple languages demonstrated both intellectual privilege and rare opportunity. Their access to such texts often came through courtly connections, family libraries, or the presence of private tutors. When women translated classical or theological texts, they performed not only linguistic mastery but also cultural reinterpretation. Translation as a material act often involved not just rendering words from one language to another but reshaping them to fit new audiences and purposes. A female translator might soften or intensify certain theological points to align with reformist or conservative beliefs. Her work, often handwritten and intended for a narrow circle, could later be recopied and recirculated, increasing its impact without the need for print. The materiality of women's writing in the Tudor period was crucial to its meaning. From the textures of manuscripts to the symbolism of book ownership, from the margins of devotionals to the bindings of courtly gifts, every physical detail carried weight. These objects were not just vessels of words but artifacts of agency. They allowed Tudor women to carve out intellectual and spiritual space, to construct identity, and to assert presence in a society that often sought their silence. By examining the material aspects of their writing, we gain a deeper understanding of the constraints and innovations that shaped female authorship. Women were not only writers but curators of their textual worlds, using every available surface, parchment, page, margin, and binding, to leave their mark. These marks remain, centuries later, as evidence of their thought, their faith, and their enduring influence. The legacy of Tudor women writers extends well beyond the years of their own lives, shaping both the intellectual culture of early modern England and the contours of feminist literary recovery in the centuries that followed. Their words, preserved through letters, devotional texts, translations, and poetry, helped shape the ideological foundations of the Jacobean and Stuart courts, influenced the emergence of the feminine voice in the English literary canon, and inspired modern scholars to re-evaluate historical narratives of authorship and power. The influence of Tudor women's writing on the Jacobean and Stuart courts can be seen most clearly in the continuities of female cultural patronage and rhetorical style. Women like Anne of Denmark and Henrietta Maria embraced their roles not only as consorts to kings but as creators and consumers of literary culture. The example set by Katherine Parr and Elizabeth I, whose printed works and performative rhetoric demonstrated the powerful fusion of piety, politics, and authorship, laid a foundation for these later queens. Anne of Denmark supported masques, pageantry, and court drama that echoed Elizabethan modes of political performance. Henrietta Maria, although Catholic and French-born, embraced English cultural forms that allowed her to project queenship through poetry, art, and patronage. Alongside this royal legacy was a shift in the expectations surrounding female literacy. The education of noblewomen became increasingly normalized, and the production of texts by women, once rare and controversial, began to find cautious acceptance. While full inclusion in literary life was still hindered by gendered limitations, the Tudor women who wrote boldly in their own voices, especially those who did so publicly, expanded the imaginative boundaries of what was possible for later generations. This influence is visible in the emergence of women poets and playwrights in the 17th century. Figures like Mary Roth, Emilia Lanier, and later Margaret Cavendish built upon the intellectual lineage of their Tudor foremothers. They inherited a precedent for self-expression through writing, especially in devotional, autobiographical, and courtly genres. The rhetorical and theological foundations laid by writers like Lady Jane Grey and Anne Askew made room for a richer and more diverse feminine voice in English letters. The Tudor legacy helped pave the way for the eventual rise of professional women writers. Aphra Behn, often hailed as the first professional female author in English, emerged in a literary environment already shaped by the textual presence of women. While Behn herself was writing in a very different social and political context, the courage and inventiveness of Tudor women made her career more thinkable. The long trajectory from manuscript prayer books to public plays and novels underscores the evolving space that women were carving out through the written word. Despite this legacy, many Tudor women writers remained invisible or forgotten for centuries. Their texts were often unpublished, attributed to others, or dismissed as secondary to male authorship. Feminist historiography and archival research in the 20th and 21st centuries have been instrumental in bringing these voices back into scholarly and public awareness. Projects in digital humanities, rare book curation, and gender studies programs have worked to recenter women within the literary history of the English Renaissance. This scholarly recovery has unearthed not only the texts themselves but also the networks of support and exchange that enabled their creation. Letters between women, dedications, courtly annotations, and household books have all come to be viewed not merely as historical curiosities but as complex records of emotional, political, and intellectual life. Feminist scholars have emphasized how such materials reveal women's capacity for critical thought, resistance, and self-representation in a patriarchal society. Moreover, modern curricula have begun to integrate these texts into a broader understanding of Renaissance literature. No longer limited to studies of Shakespeare or Spenser, academic courses now include works by women such as Katherine Parr, Elizabeth I, and Anne Askew. These inclusions challenge the traditional canon and enrich the understanding of literary production in the early modern period. Students engage not only with what women wrote but why, for whom, and under what conditions. The process of rediscovery also involves addressing misattributions and myths. Some texts historically thought to be written by men have been reconsidered as possibly female-authored. Conversely, writings attributed to famous women have sometimes been shown to be later constructions or overly romanticized. In both cases, the work of textual criticism and historical contextualization has been key to constructing a more accurate and nuanced picture of female authorship. Perhaps most powerfully, the Tudor women who wrote have inspired a re-evaluation of the very nature of authorship. In many cases, their writings defied clear genre boundaries, merged public and private voices, and questioned the limits of religious and political expression. They wrote not just to entertain or instruct but to survive, to persuade, and to define themselves. Their texts serve as acts of agency in an era that often sought to silence or constrain them. Their influence continues to be felt in contemporary debates about gender, voice, and representation. The struggles they faced and the strategies they employed resonate with modern readers navigating their own political and social landscapes. The idea that a letter, a prayer, or a poem could shape destiny remains as compelling now as it was then. In this way, the legacy of Tudor women writers is not merely historical, it is ongoing. It challenges us to listen to quieter voices, to read the margins, and to understand literature not only as art but as action. Their words were not only expressions of thought but instruments of influence. As we continue to uncover and amplify these voices, we deepen our understanding of both the past and the possibilities of the present. Tudor women writers, once confined to the margins of historical documentation, can now find renewed expression through interactive and multimedia platforms. These modern interpretive tools not only preserve and celebrate their contributions but also make their stories accessible and engaging to wider audiences. Through dramatic reenactments, digital court simulations, and educational toolkits, the legacy of these writers gains vibrant, participatory dimensions that bridge the past and present. One of the most compelling ways to revive the voices of Tudor women is through dramatic readings and reenactments. Letters, poems, and confessional writings originally composed in private or constrained circumstances gain new resonance when performed aloud. These readings offer a powerful reclamation of voice, emphasizing how sound and emotion contribute to meaning. For example, a dramatized reading of Elizabeth I's Golden Speech brings her rhetorical brilliance to life, allowing modern audiences to experience the tone, cadence, and strategic silences that marked her oratory. Similarly, the sorrowful and dignified farewell letters of Lady Jane Grey or the pious reflections of an Askew, when vocalized by skilled actors, transform written texts into emotionally charged performances. These dramatizations reclaim female authorship from the printed page and reanimate their power in contemporary settings. Theatrical reenactments extend beyond readings, encompassing full-scale performances that place women at the heart of courtly drama. Scenes of literary salons, religious debates, or moments of imprisonment become immersive experiences through costuming, set design, and character development. Reenactments of Queen Katherine Parr discussing her publications with members of her household or of Margaret Roper defending her father's philosophical legacy underscore the intellectual vigor of Tudor women. These scenes highlight how women navigated, manipulated, and sometimes subverted the ideological frameworks of their time. Virtual exhibits and court simulations present another avenue for engaging with the writings of Tudor women. Digital platforms allow for the recreation of Tudor court environments, where users can interact with historically inspired characters, explore period-accurate settings, and examine digitized manuscripts. In these spaces, users might take on the role of a Tudor noblewoman composing a letter to influence a marriage alliance or a queen editing her prayer book for publication. These role-playing opportunities emphasize the active agency of women writers, encouraging users to think critically about language, power, and historical context. These simulations can incorporate branching narratives, enabling different outcomes based on the user's choices. For example, users might decide whether to advocate for religious reform in a court pamphlet or negotiate with foreign ambassadors through strategically crafted correspondence. These simulations not only make history more accessible but also foster empathy by allowing participants to experience the constraints and decisions faced by historical women. They illuminate how written words were wielded with care, caution, and courage in a politically volatile era. Beyond entertainment and engagement, interactive media serve as invaluable educational tools. Educator toolkits tailored to secondary and university-level students can include activities such as translating Tudor letters from early modern English to contemporary vernacular, designing period-appropriate pamphlets, or creating annotated prayer book pages modeled after those used by queens like Katherine Parr or Lady Jane Grey. These tasks deepen students' understanding of language, genre, and historical context, turning abstract concepts into tangible exercises. Timeline mapping and family tree construction are additional tools for visualizing the influence of women writers. By plotting literary works against key historical events, students can trace how shifts in monarchy, religion, and diplomacy shaped the texts produced by Tudor women. Mapping familial and intellectual networks also reveals the interconnectivity of elite women, showing how ideas, texts, and support systems circulated within courtly and religious spheres. Classroom debates or digital forums can further extend these explorations. Students might role-play historical figures in discussions about succession, religious reform, or the publication of controversial texts. Taking the perspectives of figures like Elizabeth I and Askew, or Mary Tudor encourages critical thinking about authorship, intention, and consequence. These exercises foster a dynamic understanding of history, emphasizing not just what women wrote but why it mattered. Multimedia extensions also allow for interdisciplinary collaboration. Projects may integrate visual arts, such as recreating illuminated manuscripts or designing book covers inspired by original Tudor bindings. Music and soundscapes can be used to accompany readings or virtual tours, immersing users in the sonic environment of Tudor courts and chapels. These elements not only enhance engagement but also situate women's writing within the broader sensory and cultural experience of the time. Social media platforms and podcasts offer another powerful means of amplifying these voices. Curated posts, audio episodes, or short documentary clips can introduce Tudor women writers to broad audiences, particularly younger generations. The serialized nature of podcasts is well suited to biographical narratives, with each episode focusing on a different figure or theme. Interviews with historians, dramatized excerpts, and historical analyses can enrich public discourse about gender and authorship. Interactive and multimedia approaches do more than merely present information. They embody a mode of engagement that mirrors the creativity, adaptability, and resilience of the Tudor women they seek to honor. These tools provide new spaces for exploration and interpretation, transforming silent manuscripts into living conversations. By leveraging technology, performance, and pedagogy, the words of Tudor women are not only preserved but reinvigorated for future generations. The story of Tudor women writers is, at its core, a testament to the subtle yet formidable power of the pen. In an age when women were expected to remain silent or speak only in the service of male authority, their written words provided a means of self-expression, negotiation, resistance, and influence. Whether through private letters, devotional literature, translations, or political declarations, these women asserted their presence in the political, religious, and intellectual life of their time. The pen served as a subversive weapon, a way to circumvent societal constraints and redefine authority. Katherine Parr published under her own name, transforming queenship into a platform for religious and moral instruction. Elizabeth I crafted her public identity through carefully scripted speeches, balancing femininity and monarchical power with remarkable rhetorical skill. Even in captivity or on the brink of execution, women like Lady Jane Grey and Anne Askew continued to write, using language as a means to claim dignity, faith, and moral superiority in the face of state power. These acts of authorship were not incidental, they were deeply strategic. Tudor women wrote to be heard across time, to shape perception, to plead for mercy, or to guide future generations. Their words forged a legacy of female intellect and agency that challenged the patriarchal structures designed to exclude them. Their writings, while often shaped by constraints, also redefined the boundaries of what was considered possible for women in public and private life. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. Some were published in their own time, others were preserved in manuscript or reprinted in later centuries. Their works influenced successive generations of writers, contributed to theological debates, and subtly altered the cultural expectations surrounding women's literacy and authorship. They formed a collective tradition of female expression that inspired poets, historians, and reformers in the centuries that followed. Yet, for much of literary history, these contributions were marginalized or forgotten. The dominant narratives of English literature largely excluded women's voices, relegating their texts to the periphery or dismissing them as domestic or devotional rather than intellectual or political. It has taken generations of feminist scholarship to reclaim and recontextualize their contributions, to reassemble the archival evidence, and to celebrate their impact. Today we are better equipped than ever to understand and amplify these voices. Modern critical methods, digital tools, and pedagogical approaches allow us to recover the depth and complexity of their writings. Their legacy continues not only in scholarly discourse but in classrooms, museums, performances, and digital archives. Each new edition, adaptation, or study breathes new life into their words, extending their influence and inviting fresh interpretation. The power of the pen, as wielded by Tudor women, continues to resonate in the contemporary world. Their experiences mirror ongoing struggles for gender equality, access to education, and freedom of expression. Their writings remind us that voice can be a form of power even in the most constrained circumstances, and that literature is not only a mirror of society but a tool for shaping it. In revisiting their work, we do more than honor the past. We engage in a vital act of cultural restoration. We acknowledge the courage it took to write in a world that preferred women to remain silent. We recognize the intelligence, creativity, and resilience that shine through their texts. And we affirm that the legacy of these women, and the power of their pens, remains a source of inspiration and insight for all who continue to use words to question, to illuminate, and to transform.